The CEO leaned across the polished mahogany of the executive boardroom and delivered the ultimatum that had never once failed him in his entire 20-year career. "Zara, let's not make this harder than it needs to be," Richard Vance said, his voice dropping into that smooth, practiced register of a reasonable man forced to do an unreasonable thing. "We are in the final stages of a highly sensitive acquisition. The board demands a streamlined balance sheet. You are going to adjust the performance metrics for those 40 developers by end of day. Do as I said, or you can clean out your desk right now." The threat hung heavily in the sterile, air-conditioned air of the top floor. The vice president of HR shifted uncomfortably in her leather chair, keeping her eyes glued to her notepad. The chief financial officer took a slow sip of water. Everyone waited for the inevitable collapse, and the 35-year-old director of data architecture didn't say a single word. That was the part absolutely nobody in that executive suite was ready for. Not one word of argument, no protest, no desperate reasoning, no. "Richard, you can't do this. I've given 5 years of my life to this infrastructure." None of the 1,000 panicked, bargaining sentences that every other executive had ever produced when Richard pulled that particular trigger. Zara simply sat there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 seconds. She looked at him with a steady, unreadable expression that made the CFO stop chewing his ice. And then she did the strangest, quietest, most devastating thing any of them had ever seen a professional do in the face of absolute corporate power. She reached out and closed her laptop, softly, using both hands, the exact way you would close a novel you had just finished reading and had no intention of ever opening again. The small, metallic click of that aluminum lid snapping shut was somehow the loudest sound that had ever been made in the history of that building. It echoed against the glass walls. Then she stood up. She unplugged her charger, winding the white cable around her hand in neat, precise loops. It was unhurried. It was the exact movement of a woman who is not in a rush, not in a panic, and most frighteningly, not in a rage. She picked up her leather tote from the floor. She placed the laptop inside, dropped in her notebook, and zipped it shut. Zara smoothed the front of her blazer, pushed her chair back beneath the heavy table, and started walking toward the frosted glass doors. In a room filled with people who traded their dignity for stock options every single day, the sheer silence of her departure felt like a seismic event. Richard Vance's mouth physically parted. I was watching a woman walk away from a multi-six-figure salary without uttering a single syllable, and for the first time in his life, he had absolutely no idea what to do next. To truly understand why Zara's silence was so destructive to a man like Richard Vance, you have to understand the core philosophy that drove him. Richard operated on one fundamental theory of human behavior, a theory that had made him a ruthless, highly effective, and deeply feared CEO. He believed that every human being in the corporate world, no matter how highly educated, principled, or morally grounded they claim to be, has a leash. He would never use that exact word in a company town hall or a press release, but behind closed doors, it was his religion, the leash. In Richard's world, is always shaped like a financial obligation. It is the oversized variable rate mortgage in the gated suburb. It is the pair of luxury car leases sitting in the driveway. It is the private school tuition for the kids, the country club membership, the summer house, or simply the golden handcuffs of a lifestyle that requires $25,000 a month just to maintain a baseline of existence. Richard understood with chilling clarity that a professional tied to a massive monthly overhead does not actually get to have principles. They get to have opinions. But when you pull the leash, when you make it crystal clear that their moral stance will immediately cost them their carefully curated lifestyle, they fold. Every single time, they rationalize it. They tell themselves they are doing it for their family. But they fold. I didn't lead by inspiration. He led by leverage. He didn't build loyalty. He managed vulnerability. Over the years, he had perfected the art of finding out what his executives could not afford to lose, and he made sure they knew he was the one holding the keys to it. His whole career was built on the dark, undeniable discovery that smart, capable people will do almost anything, sign a misleading financial report, lay off a fiercely loyal team, hide a glaring compliance violation if you make the alternative financially ruinous. But Richard wasn't reckless. He was a corporate sniper. Before he aimed an ultimatum at someone, he did his homework. He looked at a person's background, the way a predatory lender looks at collateral. He checked their lifestyle, their marital status, their perceived dependencies. He only fired his weapon at people he had calculated were too trapped to survive the hit. If you had a cushion, he negotiated with you. If you were trapped, he dictated to you. And when a deeply unethical task landed on his desk, he went looking for the most leveraged person in the building to execute it. On paper, Zara looked like the perfect corporate target. She was 35, a black woman who had fought her way up from the bottom into the senior leadership of a notoriously cutthroat, male-dominated tech firm. Richard's assumptions about her were built on lazy systemic biases. But to him, they were just reliable data points. She had no husband and no dual income safety net to fall back on. She had grown up working class in a Rust Belt city, a fact she had proudly mentioned in her initial interview, which to Richard meant she likely had zero generational wealth. She held a highly visible, highly paid director role. In Richard's mind, someone from her background who had finally clawed her way to the executive suite would cling to that salary with absolute desperation. She had the title, the prestige, and the $250,000 base income that he assumed she was using to support extended family or pay off a mountain of private student loans. To his mind, she was the most leashed person in the room. Her hard-earned status was her trap. That was exactly why he chose her for the dirty job. He didn't give her the task because she was the right data architect. He gave it to her because he was absolutely certain she couldn't afford to say no. The company was quietly preparing to be acquired by a Silicon Valley titan. But to make the balance sheet look flawless and maximize the executive payout, Richard needed to eliminate a massive looming liability, the unvested equity of 40 senior developers. If those developers stayed on the payroll for another 3 weeks, their restricted stock units RSUs would hit their vesting cliff, costing the acquiring company over $15 million. Richard's order to Zara was elegant in its cruelty. As the director of data, she was to subtly alter the back-end performance tracking algorithm, artificially deflating the sprint velocity metrics of those 40 specific developers retroactively over the last 2 quarters. This would create a documented, data-driven excuse to terminate them for cause just days before their options vested. Zara had to be the one to press the button. Her pristine reputation for data integrity would legitimize the firings. He needed her credibility to wash his hands of the crime. It's just an algorithm adjustment, Zara, Richard had said in that boardroom, pushing a printed mandate across the table. His eyes locked onto hers. Make the data fit the narrative. We need this acquisition to go through. It secures everyone's future. Do as I said, or you can clean out your desk right now. He leaned back, steepled his fingers, and waited for the fold. He waited for the heavy sigh, the uncomfortable shift in her seat, the rationalization, the moment where she negotiated for a retention bonus to do the dirty work. He had seen it 100 times. Instead, she closed her laptop and walked out. Now you understand why Zara never said a word. She understood a fundamental rule of corporate power that most professionals spend their entire lives missing. Some requests do not deserve a debate. They deserve an immediate departure. If she had argued the ethics of the situation, if she had pointed out the massive legal risks under employment law, if she had pleaded for the developers who had worked nights and weekends for years, She would have been engaging. She would have treated his deeply corrupt, borderline illegal order as a legitimate business proposal that reasonable minds could debate in a boardroom. The second you try to eloquently explain to someone why you won't compromise your integrity, you have already lost something vital. You are agreeing to the premise that your integrity is up for discussion. Zara didn't believe it was to her. This wasn't a bad operational pivot to be managed. It was an attempt to buy her soul, to turn her into the exact kind of executive she despised. And you simply do not negotiate with someone who is trying to purchase your character. Explaining implies there is a price, and that the price just hasn't been met yet. You just leave the room. Her silence was a fortress. The zipped bag on her shoulder was a final verdict. It communicated more brutally than any HR complaint ever could. This is not a conversation. I will not grant you the dignity of my defense. You are trying to use me to rob my people, and my response is that you no longer exist in my world. There is no corporate countermove to that. A manipulator cannot control an employee who simply refuses to play the game. The question Richard Vance was left screaming in his own head as the glass doors swung shut. The exact question every other stunned executive at the table was thinking was simple. How the hell can she afford to do that? The answer was sitting in a series of aggressively funded Vanguard index funds and a high-yield savings account that absolutely nobody at the company knew about. Zara called it her walk-away ledger. Years ago, early in her career when she was just a junior data analyst, Zara had watched a brilliant, kind-hearted technical manager get backed into a corner. He was a father of 3 with a massive mortgage in a high cost of living area, and the company forced him to take the fall for a massive data breach he had actively warned them about. Zara watched that man sign his own professional death warrant, signing a gag order and taking the blame, not because he was weak, but because he was 3 missed paychecks away from personal bankruptcy. That night, sitting in her small, cramped apartment, Zara realized a terrifying truth about corporate America. The system is structurally designed to keep high earners living paycheck to paycheck. The culture encourages you to upgrade your car, buy the bigger house, wear the designer clothes, and inflate your lifestyle until you are thoroughly trapped by your own success. A person who desperately needs their next annual bonus to pay off their credit card debt does not have principles. They have hostages. Zara decided she would never, ever be taken hostage for a decade, while her peers leased Teslas, bought second homes, and posted photos from 5-star resorts in Tulum. Zara lived invisibly. She stayed in her modest, rent-controlled apartment long after her salary doubled, then tripled. She drove a reliable, anonymous Honda sedan. She didn't buy luxury handbags. She cooked at home. She lived on roughly 40% of her income. Every single month, quietly and ruthlessly, she bought her freedom. She wasn't saving for a status symbol. She wasn't even saving for an early retirement. She was saving for one specific conversation. The day a powerful executive looked her in the eye and asked her to compromise her soul, and made it clear what it would cost to refuse. Zara had spent 10 years buying the ability to stand up and walk out of that exact room. Zara walked out of the corporate headquarters on a Tuesday afternoon. By Wednesday morning, the internal rumor mill had mutated into a toxic, unstoppable wildfire. The 40 developers on her team, the very people she had just tanked her own pristine career to protect, knew only what the optics suggested. From their perspective, the company was facing restructuring, the pressure of the acquisition was mounting, and their beloved director had simply abandoned ship to save herself. They saw her leave the executive boardroom, walk to her desk, pack her personal items without making eye contact with anyone, and disappear into the elevator. In the absence of truth, frightened and stressed employees always assume the absolute worst. By Thursday, when the HR department announced a sudden leadership transition and the modified performance reviews dropped. The narrative was permanently cemented. The engineers believed Zara had seen the bloodbath coming, negotiated her own lucrative golden parachute, and left them to take the hit. In private Slack channels, Discord servers, and happy hour venting sessions, the people Zara had mentored, fought for, and protected for years called her a sellout, at DevTeam. Did Zara really just bounce WTF, at backend lead? Guess she got hers, typical executive trash. This is the cruelest, most realistic aspect of professional sacrifice. You rarely get a heroic soundtrack. Zara knew exactly what it would look like when she walked out without leaving a dramatic, company-wide manifesto. She knew the corporate machine would control the narrative. But she also knew that doing the right thing and getting credit for doing the right thing are two entirely different transactions. In the adult world, you almost never get both. She sat in her quiet apartment, drinking black coffee, watching her phone light up with angry, betrayed texts from junior staff. And she didn't answer a single one. To defend herself would mean breaking her strict non-disclosure agreement, which would give Richard the legal leverage to sue her into oblivion and freeze her assets. She chose to eat their contempt. She let them hate her, because her silence was the only thing keeping her legally safe while the real trap was being set. Richard Vance, being the pragmatic, emotionless operator that he was, didn't waste time mourning Zara's sudden departure. It took him less than 24 hours to find a willing replacement. His name was Greg, the VP of Analytics, who had just purchased a sprawling, severely overpriced house in the Hamptons and had a spouse with very expensive tastes. When Richard called Greg into the exact same boardroom and handed him the printed algorithm mandate, Greg didn't close his laptop. He didn't walk out. Greg looked at the paper, swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the door, and asked exactly one question. Will my execution on this strategic realignment be reflected in my end-of-year equity bonus? Richard smiled, a thin, predatory smile nodded. And Greg logged into the system. The deed was done. The algorithm was tweaked. The historical Sprint data was weaponized. 40 developers were abruptly terminated for chronic underperformance just 8 days before their options vested. The company saved $15 million. The balance sheet looked pristine for the upcoming acquisition, and it was all written off as standard operational downsizing. For about 3 weeks, it was a flawless corporate murder. Except, in the modern tech era, digital fingerprints never truly vanish. A change that massive in a heavily audited data pipeline leaves a very distinct trail. Zara hadn't just walked out. Before she left her desk, she had officially declined the project ticket in the internal Jira system. She didn't just decline it, she tagged it with a specific, highly regulated compliance code indicating data integrity, conflict, ethical violation. She hadn't leaked anything to the press. She hadn't stolen proprietary documents. She had simply used the company's own bureaucratic compliance system to log her absolute refusal, knowing that Greg would have to manually override her security tag to push the corrupted algorithm through. Zara had quietly armed a digital landmine, walked out of the building, and waited for the auditors representing the acquiring company to do their standard due diligence. Greg thought he was being a team player. I didn't realize he had just signed his name to massive, provable corporate fraud. The explosion didn't happen on a factory floor or on someone's front porch. It happened in a sterile, windowless data room during the final M&A due diligence phase. The acquiring firm had hired a ruthless team of forensic auditors from one of the Big Four accounting firms. During a routine sweep of the engineering division's productivity metrics, an auditor flagged a sudden, mathematically impossible drop in the performance of 40 top-tier engineers right before a vesting cliff. They dug deeper. They pulled the back-end system logs. They found the manually overridden algorithm, and sitting right there, glowing in the system history, They found Zara's original compliance block code 44, ethical data conflict. The narrative unraveled with violent, unstoppable speed. When the acquiring tech giant realized Richard Vance was trying to sell them a company facing a massive, guaranteed class action ERISA lawsuit for deliberate equity theft. They threatened to pull out of the multi-billion-dollar deal immediately. To save the acquisition, the board of directors panicked. They needed a sacrificial lamb, and they found two. Greg was fired immediately, his reputation completely destroyed in the industry, and his own unvested shares revoked for gross misconduct. Richard Vance, the untouchable CEO who thought he was the smartest man in every room, was forced into an immediate early retirement. He was stripped of his board seat, denied his golden parachute, and escorted out the back door by corporate security on a Friday afternoon. The 40 developers were immediately reinstated with full equity vesting and quiet, massive hush money bonuses to sign liability waivers. And as the internal investigation report inevitably leaked through the company's whisper network, the developers finally saw the system logs. They saw exactly who had been ordered to build the weapon that killed them, and what she had done instead. They realized Zara hadn't run from the bloodbath. She had thrown her entire career onto the tracks to try and derail the train. The woman they had spent a month cursing in private messages had walked away from a small fortune to keep her hands clean of their blood. A senior back-end lead, a man who had been the loudest in calling her a traitor, found her personal email address and sent a single, devastatingly short message. "We saw the audit logs. We didn't know. I am so deeply, deeply sorry." 6 months later, Zara was attending a high-level tech conference in Seattle, stepping off a panel she had just expertly moderated on ethical data architecture. The industry had quietly figured out why she left her last role, and her reputation for unshakable integrity had easily landed her a VP position at a company that actually valued ethics over optics. As she walked toward the lobby coffee shop, a man stepped out of the shadow of a marble pillar. It was Richard Vance. He looked noticeably older, visibly diminished, stripped of the invisible armor that the CEO title had given him for 2 decades. He didn't come to apologize. Men like Richard don't know how to apologize. He came because his ego was still bleeding, and he needed to solve a puzzle that had kept him awake for 6 months. "I checked you," he said, his voice lacking its old booming authority, sounding almost fragile. "Before I put that order in front of you, I ran the numbers. I looked at your profile. You had no safety net. You grew up with nothing. You should have been terrified of losing that income. I made sure of it." Zara stopped, holding her coffee, looking at the man who used to control her life. She didn't feel anger, just a profound sense of pity. "You checked my demographics. Richard, you didn't check my discipline." She spoke calmly, evenly. "You assumed because I was making big money. I was spending big money. You assumed I bought into the exact same golden handcuffs that Greg did." "How did you do it?" Richard asked, genuine bewilderment in his eyes. "How does a director walk away from that much money without blinking?" "I lived like a junior analyst for 10 years, Zara said simply. "Every bonus, every raise, every stock vest. I banked it. I didn't buy the Tesla. I didn't buy the penthouse. I bought an escape hatch. You've spent 20 years winning against executives who were too broke to say no to you. You didn't lose to me because I'm braver than Greg. You lost because I could afford to tell you to go to hell. And he couldn't." Richard stood in the bustling lobby of the convention center, the reality of his defeat finally, permanently sinking in. His entire worldview, the cynical belief that every single person has a price, that morality is just a luxury good, had been completely shattered by a woman who simply valued her freedom more than her status. He had mistaken financial leverage for actual leadership, and the very moment he met someone who was unleashable, his empire collapsed. Zara gave him a brief, polite nod, the kind you give a stranger who asks for directions, turned on her heel, and walked away, leaving him entirely in the past. Here is the most uncomfortable truth about the corporate world. the lesson that adults rarely teach each other until it is far too late. Most professionals do not compromise their ethics because they are inherently bad people. They do it because they cannot afford to be good. When you have a massive mortgage, 2 luxury car payments, and a lifestyle that demands every single dollar of your executive paycheck, your boss knows they own you. Courage in the professional world is not a personality trait. It is not something you are born with. Courage is a mathematical equation. It is a balance sheet. In the exact moment of truth, when someone with power over you asks you to betray your team, cook the books, or look the other way, your ability to say no is rarely about how brave you feel in your heart. It is entirely about how financially free you are in your bank account. Freedom, the real kind of freedom, is not summoned in a moment of panic. It is built slowly, quietly, boringly, over years of deliberate financial discipline. It is built out of 1,000 small refusals to let the system own you. Every luxury you choose to forego is a leash you refuse to wear. Every dollar you invest is a boundary you are drawing around your soul. You are not saving for a retirement home in Florida. You are saving for the day someone tries to buy your integrity. Don't trap yourself in the exhausting illusion of corporate prestige. Buy the ultimate luxury, the ability to stand up, close your laptop, and walk out of the room. That is the only real power you will ever have.